Hello, I'm Helen Such from the Australian National University. I led the ANU team, funded by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, in the Individual Deprivation Measure study in South Africa in 2019. The Individual Deprivation Measure, or IDM, is an individual-level, gender-sensitive measure of multidimensional deprivation. As part of the study in South Africa, we collected some important data about deprivation for people with disabilities. In this video, I'm going to highlight some of this data, which we hope can provide an evidence base to increase the effectiveness of poverty reduction policies and programs. This is one of 5 videos where our team presents overviews of the analyses we've done with the South African data. And at the end, I'll point you to where you can find out more. There are 2 parts to the survey in South Africa, a national level main sample and a purposive sample. The data for both was collected by our local partner, ICAPA Data, in 2019, and the same questionnaires were used for both samples. In the national level main sample, more than 8,600 individuals were interviewed across the country. We also ran a purposive sample of people with disabilities in Gauteng and Limpopo provinces, where we identified individuals with disabilities and then invited them and their household members to participate. I'll focus on the comparisons between those with disabilities and those without from the national level sample in this video, because that's the sample we have the most up-to-date analysis for. However, far more analysis is possible using both samples. The IDM measures 14 different dimensions of deprivation, the choice of which came from a combination of earlier participatory work to determine the priorities of poor men and women, but they were also selected on the basis that they could be responsive to poverty reduction policies. In the analysis, each person's responses to the survey are used to create indicators, which we then use to build themes and then the 14 dimensions. A composite index, the IDM Index Score, is then created by aggregating each individual's scores for each of these 14 dimensions. The IDM Index Score is presented as a score out of 100. Higher scores mean less severe deprivation, and lower scores indicate more severe deprivation. Higher proportions of people with disabilities have lower scores, the dark blue-coloured bars, and there are higher proportions of people without disabilities that have higher scores, the light blue-coloured bars. This shows that, overall, people with disabilities face greater deprivation than people without. You can see that these IDM index scores can therefore be used to identify groups of people facing deprivations of different severity, and their profiles of deprivation can then be examined, so that policies or programs to address those specific patterns can be designed and targeted. So we need to understand more detail about the similarities and differences in these patterns, which we can do by examining the dimension-level results. For 3 dimensions, shelter, sanitation, and voice, there aren't any differences between those with and without disabilities. And individuals without disabilities are worse off in family planning. But the most clear indication of the different patterns of deprivation is that people with disabilities are worse off in 9 of the 14 dimensions. I don't think many people will be surprised to know that 2 of the biggest differences are in the health and education dimensions. Though I'll only discuss the health dimension, which assesses both health status and healthcare access and quality. With respect to health status, people with disabilities are more likely to be more deeply deprived in both physical health and in psychosocial health. Probably both of these results are expected. However, these deprivations are compounded by the fact that people with disabilities are also more deprived in healthcare quality. In this theme, around half of those without disabilities accessed healthcare in the 12 months prior to our survey, compared to almost 3/4 of those with disabilities. Further, double the proportion of people with disabilities compared to those without reported 2 or more problems with the quality of the care that they'd received, or they'd been unable to access healthcare facilities because of a lack of accessibility or exclusion. The knock-on effects for people with disabilities of these experiences of poorer quality healthcare are likely to be important. The IDM also collects information on social aspects of deprivation, such as in the relationships dimension. This has a theme on dependence and support, which looks at whether and how respondents are dependent on people who don't live with them to help provide basic needs because they can't provide those things for themselves. By basic needs, we mean things like food, water, and shelter. Less than a third of people without disabilities rely on such support, compared to half of respondents with disabilities. There are also higher proportions of people with disabilities than those without, in each of the categories indicating more severe deprivation. And the differences between the two groups grows with the increasing severity of deprivation. So those with disabilities are more likely to require support with basic necessities, but are less likely to receive enough of this support than people without disabilities. The IDM data can also be used to illuminate the activities of individuals within and outside the home. For example, our data confirms that a higher proportion of people with disabilities are excluded from the workforce because of their disability. However, they are slightly worse off in the time use dimension. This assesses the time spent on paid work or subsistence production and on unpaid domestic and care work and other obligatory time commitments. It also assesses on-call time, the time spent caring for others in the household. So if people with disabilities are less likely to be in the labour force, but face slightly greater time burdens, this indicates that a range of activities are being carried out within the home by people with disabilities. In conclusion, I've only been able to highlight the way the IDM data can quantify the size of some of the differences in the experience of people with disabilities compared to those without. And the results show that there are much worse outcomes for those with disabilities. The size of these differences also seems to increase with the severity of disability. By collecting the IDM data in the way that we do, we can show who is poor and how individuals experience poverty differently. For example, how experiences are affected by characteristics such as gender or disability status. The IDM data has enormous potential to help increase the effectiveness of poverty reduction policies. For example, it could be used to target the most severely deprived groups or individuals, and the data can also provide an evidence base for the design of those policies and programs so that they can address the specific patterns of deprivation experienced by different groups. You can find more details about the IDM in general, about the South African data analysis, and an Indonesian study at the website shown on screen. There are also other videos about the South African study there, on the sampling methodology, giving an overview of the South African study, and highlighting the results of our subgroup analyses by gender, by age group, and by rural or urban locality. All of our publications presenting the results of our analyses are also there.